Psychoanalysis, the 5 subjects. The concept of the subject has come to the center stage after Lacan defined this concept in a unique way. Usually, we used to think in terms of subject and the object. And when we said subject and the object, the word subject usually was reserved for the conscious entity, the man. And when we used this word in a deeper sense, if we were to categorize man into his persona and the real self, we would be looking at subject to be used generally for the real self in man. Subject was never thought of as a problem into itself. It was rather thought of as something authentic, something real, something genuine, something natural, something pure. Lacan brought in this concept that the subject itself is a troubled concept. And there seems to be no escape from this troubled state into which we are, because we, that is the subject, is a troublesome state, a troublesome entity into itself. And this created a new way of looking at ourselves as who we are in a different way than the traditional way of the real us and the social us, or the persona, or the adjusting us, or the coping us, or the front of us. So there was a front and there was a real us. The front we call as persona and the real self inside, or the real personality inside. Lacan brings in an element of a new concept here, where he says not only there is a persona and the real self, but the real self itself is not completely real. The subject, this thing itself, is a troubled thing. And this is put in the context of a metapsychology, which is not very clear in its own origins. Why? We'll go into it in a few moments. Elaborating upon Lacan's concept of the subject, I understand the word subject in a slightly different way. And from my standpoint, we are dealing with 5 different subjects, not one subject. Today's discussion will go into what are these 5, what is their significance, and how conceptual clarification, elaboration, pathogenesis and healing, and also the model of the mind, how all of them stand better if we understand the 5 subjects differently. And these 5 subjects are elemental into themselves. So let us get into these 5 subjects and see how they are different from Lacan, how it modifies the Lacanian concept of the subject, how it elaborates the primal concept of the subject itself, and how that expanded collection of concepts around the word subject helps us to do psychoanalysis better. Lacan postulates that the subject comes into being in the act of the mirror stage. The individual, the child, the infant, finds disintegration and chaos inside of him, doesn't experience a very strong or efficient coordinator who can coordinate these disparate sensations and feelings and thoughts and ideas, regulate the traffic, and create a peaceful, calm, stable, focused personality. And in the middle of it, the individual who is feeling so chaotic and disintegrated, unregulated, uncoordinated inside sees himself in the mirror as one whole thing, or sees in the eyes of the other, or in the way others behave with him as though he is one integrated, coordinated, peaceful, focused unit, capable of thought, capable of feeling, capable of action, capable of relating. From this mirroring in the environment, the idea occurs to the individual of being a cohesive, integrated, solid oneself, capable of full coordination, regulation, capable of thought, emotion, and action, capable of relating, capable of growth, capable of everything that is humanly expected out of a human. And this false idea is taken as one's own, and a subject is created. It's an act of learning out of expectation of others, but the learning becomes perpetual, solid, coordinated, enduring, and becomes almost a structural component of the personality. Not almost, it becomes a structural component of the personality. And this component is what Lacan calls the subject. A subject which is an escape, which is a narcissistic self-acceptance of a fantasy of others about oneself. So the subject is created in interaction with the other, even though the subject may not at that point have a very clear idea of what the other actually means, what are the intentions of the other, what is the reliability and the credibility of the other, what is the efficiency and accuracy of the other. This self-image as a result of mechanism is what Lacan calls as the subject. I prefer to use the term the other self. That part of oneself which has come up in interaction with the other, learning from the other, later on adjusting with the other, pleasing the other, saving oneself from the other, conquering the other, having the other. This, what Lacan calls as the subject, I call it the other self. And the matrix before the other self is formed, before Lacan's subject comes into existence, that matrix of the primordial state of disintegration, chaos, lack of focus, lack of self, lack of clear thought, lack of clear feelings, lack of anything stable and enduring happening inside. That state, that primordial state Lacan refers to, I call that the true felt self. The true felt self. It's a primal state, one of the primal states. But there are other entities which I define. So there is Lacan's subject, which I call the other self. The matrix from which the other self emerges, I call that matrix as the true felt self. And not only the matrix, but how one feels oneself when that matrix is on. So it's not the matrix, but in that primal state, when one reflects on oneself, and we'll go into that primal state, but there is a primal state before the subject comes into existence. And in that primal state, and it's actually a series of states, that primal zone of many states, many primal states, in that duration, when one reflects upon oneself, the kind of self one sees oneself to be before the subject comes into existence, I call it the true felt self. But this is not where the story ends of the subject or the self. Even as there is a conscious activity, even before mechanism, even before the subject comes into existence, even as the true felt self is experienced, even as the subject comes into existence, even as a subject goes out into the world, there is a continuing activity in the unconscious, which is always going on. It goes on when the true felt self is in existence. It goes on when the other self or the subject of Lacan comes into existence, goes on after that, and has been going on even before that, which is what I call the natural self. The constitutional personality, along with its defenses, and the sense of natural I and not I. There is no psychological sense of I and not I, but there is a natural sense of I. It may not have a clear sense of not I, but there is a natural sense of I. One can even postulate a natural sense of not I existing from birth. And the most primitive defenses at the service of survival and pleasure are operating unconsciously in the unconscious. So there is a component of the ego which is operating in the unconscious right from birth. And the sum total of the self inside of oneself in the unconscious is the natural self, which comes from one's constitution and the way defenses operate in the light of the environment at the unconscious state, in the unconscious level. holistically thinking, the natural self also carries, if one believes, and I am on the side of belief, traces from past births, traces from intergenerational trauma, traces from history of the community. Apart from one's unique constitutionality. So apart from one's unique constitution, there are traces from past lives, traces of intergenerational good and difficult parts, traces of the historical experience of the race into which one is born. And there is this natural self, which has a primitive personality of its own, operating completely unconsciously in the unconscious. I mean, operating in the unconscious, not operating unconsciously in the unconscious, but operating in the unconscious. There are two more states of self, two more concepts of self which we need for a clear discussion. The authentic self, which is a composite entity of integration of parts from the natural self and parts from the other self. And this authentic self, which of course is created in association with the big other, in conjunction with the society, is very deeply seated, and therefore we talk about the persona, the authentic self, and the spiritual self. And the authentic self is where we feel that we are most ourselves experientially, and for most people this is the deepest part of themselves that they can get in touch with. From a Jungian standpoint, this authentic self is coming from one's unique archetypal endowment, unique program of life, and in touch with the persona and the society outside. So this is not pure inside without the outside, but it is a combination of the inside, the maximum inside, the authentic, purest inside, as free from the effect of outside as possible, but taking data and specifics from the outside to arrive at specific concepts and the specific forms of desire. And then there is a spiritual self. And the spiritual self, which few people can experience in their lifetime, is the deepest part of oneself. And in this state, one can be aware of all other parts of oneself. Or if one goes very deep in this state, all other parts of oneself are deactivated, and you experience only pure spiritual self. And this pure spiritual self can be experienced in a variety of ways. It can be experienced as a state of no thought and pure awareness and bliss. It can be experienced as an all-negating absolute. It can be experienced as oneness with existence. It can be experienced as just pure awareness, not even bliss. It can be experienced as being lost completely into the state of ecstasy or bliss. So these are various stages of the experience of the spiritual self. There can be a corollary, which is I find it difficult whether to call it spiritual or not call it spiritual, but there can be a loss of all the other self if one goes into pure inertia. It's a different state altogether. And therefore, we need to define these terms to talk about different experiences which are so distinct into themselves. And the dynamics of each of the experience, the structural and the functional journey of those experiences in the personality are very different. So these are different self concept definitions, right, other than the Lacanian subject. So I would define the Lacanian subject as the other self and then define 4 other categories of self. And then carry on discourse using these terms. Now let us come to the states, because the concept of the self, especially the subject and its emergence, happens in very rare states which are not our everyday experiences. And therefore, it's necessary to go into the rare states which exist in very early life. And as adults, those states happen very rarely and for short durations of time. Those who are interested in different experiences of the spiritual self, or to rephrase it, different experiences of what constitutes enlightenment, can look at my other episode of FAQ enlightenment, or look at the episode on Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, where Rishi Patanjali talks about different states of enlightenment. And I add to it a few. Coming to states, there is an episode I have recorded on the primal states, generic primal states, or generic primal zones, something of this title. Primal zones or primal state, just go into it for details. The primal state, or rather the primal zone, which constitutes of many states, is the zone of very early life. And there is a contest here between the Freudian approach and the Kleinian approach. Freud postulates a pre-object stage of primary narcissism, the stage where one feels oceanic oneness, but there is no other because there is no concept of the object. Klein postulates that there is never an object-free stage, that the mind, the human mind essentially is an object mechanism. So it will create objects if none exists, but there cannot be an object-free state. Empirical investigations are more on the side of Klein, but I do agree with Freud that there are primal states of object-free nature. These states may be rare states, not enduring for a long time, but these states exist. There cannot be a denial that you can be in an object-free state. So in a general sense, 99% of the times, we are in an object stage, like Klein says, but in very early life, There are states where you don't have objects, and on that point, I agree with Freud more than Klein. And that early primal state can go into various shapes. The early primal state can be an object-free state, and it's the primal zone, not a primal state. So there are many states in the primal zone. Let me just correct it to the primal zone. So there is a primal zone of many states in early life. And in that zone, there are many states. Let us go through some of them. First, object-free state. And that object-free state can be the state of bliss of primary narcissism, or it can be the bliss, it can be the state of pure terror. Or some other affect can be active, but there are no objects. It's only that state which is largely uncoordinated, but occasionally can get into a harmonious state when you feel the bliss of primary narcissism. And in many cases of psychosis with negative features, when the person seems extremely ecstatic and blissful, but with negative features of psychosis, it is the regression to that state of primal narcissism and the bliss, which is a very difficult state to give up because it is so pleasant and addictive. So there is this primal zone in which one of the states is the state of object-free state of primary narcissism and bliss, an object-free state without bliss but with difficult feelings, and occasionally a state of coordination but without any strong affect. It also brings us to the idea of pure affect, that you can have activation of affect without it being directed to any object, which is contrary to most conventional beliefs, that affect activates in response to objects, or if affect has activated by itself, mind will create an object to direct the affect. Both of them are true, but it's also true that you can have pure affect. We are talking about rare instances here. You can have pure affect activated without it being directed to any object. And that is where, with regard to difficult feelings, the terror arises because one is afraid of looking at pure affect, because the pure affect can turn on oneself. And even before it has turned on oneself, there is a terror of it happening so. And when the pure affect turns on oneself, there is an absolute terror, and defenses have to come in to deflect it outside on some object or inside towards some object. Then we have the state of oneself as the only object. So there is activation of affect, there is activation of intention, but all all of it is towards oneself, inside, and oneself is the only object. So there can be activation of pure affect, and it comes over oneself. And this is the oceanic state of when the oneself is the only object of all the affects. Then you have the gestalt state, where there is an oceanic state and internal objects are created, but it's one gestalt, one oceanic whole in which differentiation has happened from a one object, oceanic object state to a state of many objects, but still it is all inside, it is one. There is an intra-oceanic differentiation. And then there is a state when one experiences object as outside of oneself, the I and not I comes into being. And then the breast is experienced as the something outside and not something inside. And then we have the state where the society comes in, where there is me, the other object, and there is a third object, and the social dynamic starts. In fact, the social state starts not only with the third, but even with the second, the moment we realize that it is not an object in our control, but with a mind of its own. And that is where the social state starts in one sense. So the moment you move from the breast to the mother, the concept of the mother is where the social state starts. The mother becomes the first big other. And then we have the father, where through him, a large amount of big other comes in. And then we have the full society. So initially we have in the mother, the small big other, and in the father, a large big other, before we actually go out into the society and really see the full big other. So the big other enters in parts. The inner journey of self-development then is, and that is where the healing line also has to proceed, from the other self, the subject, to the authentic self first. Discover the authentic self, live it out as much as one can. So first, discovery and understanding of the other self. Step 2, discovery, understanding and living of the authentic self. Step 3, work on the natural self, on defenses and optimize it. Step 4, start looking at the spiritual self, and in the journey, the true felt self comes as the passing stage, which the Buddhists say is the state of disintegration one feels, like in the state of loneliness or like in the state of some evenings when one goes deep into oneself. And this true felt self, this disintegrated self is felt. This is also felt when the ego disintegrates under pressure from outside or inside. Also felt after abandonment. So once we start the quest for the spiritual self, deep into the journey, there comes a state where one experiences the true felt self. In parts, of course, one doesn't go completely disintegrated and psychotic, but a reasonable journey of this state happens, and then slowly the spiritual self is experienced more often, comes into the front, comes into the center, and then in the light of it, other parts of oneself get optimized. That is how the journey course. So this conceptual elaboration of 5 subjects and early life rare zones is very essential for further discourse, clearer discourse, and doing psychoanalysis better. So with this, we will end today's small discussion and then go on to other Lacanian concepts where I elaborate my concepts differently than the way Lacan has done. If you're interested, you can look at the model of the mind heat. One episode I have recorded on that. So we'll go on building the conceptual edifice as we go along. For the moment, we stop here. Thank you.